Good morning, students. In our last class, we have already discussed the respiratory system in human being and particularly the respiratory organ lungs. And our second topic is breathing mechanism. कहीं आम एटमोस्फेरिक ऑक्सीजन टी को गोटे रेस्पिरेटरी सिस्टम माध्यम लंग्स पर्यंत आनिले बट ओनली रेस्पिरेटरी सिस्टम और द रेस्पिरेटरी पाथ इज नॉट सफिशिएंट. For that there is another mechanism is required, and that is breathing mechanism. So what is that breathing mechanism? Breathing or mechanism of breathing. Mechanism of breathing. It is the incoming of oxygen or taking in of the oxygen rich fresh air into the lungs and expelling out of the carbon dioxide rich foul air to the atmosphere. For breathing mechanism, students, first of all, there is one thoracic cavity, The thoracic cavity is formed by the following structure. Here is your sternum, and here is your vertebral column, It is your diaphragm, and it is the shoulder bone, and to the sternum and vertebral column there is presence of 12 pairs of ribs. 12 pairs of ribs. This is ribs. And the 12 pairs of ribs, they are connected with each other, by two sets of muscle, One is external intercostal muscle, and internal intercostal muscle. In this way, These are the muscles. In this way, one thoracic cavity is formed, and that thoracic cavity limited by the limiting structure of thoracic cavity, sternum on its ventral surface and the vertebral column on its dorsal surface, sternum on its ventral surface, shoulder bone on its anterior surface, and diaphragm on its posterior surface, and ribs on its lateral surface. So with these following structure, one cavity is formed, that is called chest cavity or thoracic cavity, and the 12 pairs of ribs, they are interconnected with each other by two sets of intercostal muscle, external intercostal and internal intercostal muscle, and inside which one pair of lungs remain airtight, inside which one pair of lungs remain airtight. This is one pair of lungs. Remain. So, ପିଲାମାନେ, for our breathing mechanism, this knowledge must you have. There is one thoracic cavity. That thoracic cavity is formed by the following structure: sternum on its ventral surface, vertebral column, particularly thoracic vertebrae of vertebral column on its our dorsal surface, the shoulder bone on our anterior surface, and the muscular diaphragm on its posterior surface, and to the sternum and vertebral column, ribs are connected with each other and by two sets of muscle, and inside which one pair of lungs remain airtight. So that is thoracic cavity. And breathing has two phases. One is inspiration or inhalation, another expiration or exhalation. So inspiration and expiration are the two phases of breathing mechanism. So let's see what happens during inspiration, so that the atmospheric oxygen entered into the lungs, and what happens during expiration, so that the carbon dioxide rich foul air expelled out of the lungs to the atmosphere. देखो, so first come to inspiration. Inspiration, it is one active process. It is one active process in which mechanical energy is consumed. Mechanical energy we consume. Okay? So, two sets of muscle. One is your phrenic muscle. And another external intercostal muscle. these two muscles are required for the process of inspiration. So what happens during inspiration? What happens during inspiration? First come to your phrenic muscle. In this phrenic muscle is attached to the diaphragm. From diaphragm to ribs and the vertebral column. The phrenic muscles attached to diaphragm and phrenic muscle attached to diaphragm to attached to diaphragm with a ribs and vertebral column. A ribs and vertebral column. So when this phrenic muscle contracts, on contraction of the phrenic muscle, the diaphragm, on contraction diaphragm becomes flattened, okay, and the external on contraction of intercostal muscle due to phrenic muscle रो contraction जोगु diaphragm टा पिला माने ये जो डोम शेप डे की थिला ये आस्ते आस्ते कौन हला फ्लैटेंड हला जो जोटा गोटे कन्वेक्स शेप रे ये आस्ते आस्ते फ्लैटेंड हला. सो यही अमाउंट रो स्पेस एनलार्ज हला एवं ऑन कंट्रैक्शन ऑफ ड्यू टू कंट्रैक्शन ऑफ इंटरकोस्टल muscle, external intercostal muscle, the sternum ribs becomes forward and upward. The sternum and ribs become forward and upward. Forward and upward. So that what happens, the volume of thoracic cavity increases. And as one pair of lungs remain airtight, also volume of lungs increases. And as we know, if volume increases, pressure decreases. And if volume decreases, pressure increases as per Boyle's law. Okay? तेणु जिते बड़े thoracic cavity रो वॉल्यूम बढ़ी गला ता भितर जेहेतु गोटे पेयर लंग्स एयर टाइट होकरी अछि तार वॉल्यूम भी बढ़िला एवं वॉल्यूम बढ़िले प्रेशर कोन हला पिला माने कमिला. तेणु प्रेशर कमिले बाहर जे कि एटमॉस्फेयर रे ऑक्सीजन is at a higher partial pressure that is at 159, it rushes into the lungs where it is at lower partial pressure 100, and that is called inspiration. That means partial pressure of oxygen at atmosphere is 159 mm of mercury, and partial pressure of oxygen at lungs it is at 100 mm of mercury. सो पिला माने आउ थरे मेकानिज्म टाकू सुनो टिके व्हाट इज इंस्पिरेशन एंड एक्सपिरेशन इनहेलेशन एंड एक्सहेलेशन प्रश्वास एंड निश्वास आर द टू फेजेस ऑफ ब्रीदिंग मेकानिज्म and during inspiration first of all what happens what is inspiration first it is the taking in of the atmospheric fresh atmospheric oxygen rich fresh air into the lungs so what happens during that inspiration ना कौन ना आमर गोटे एमती थोरासिक कैविटी टी अच्छी थोरासिक कैविटी टी फॉलोइंग स्ट्रक्चर द्वारा कन्फाइंड होती स्टर्नम अच्छी तार वेंट्राल सरफेस रे वर्टिब्रल कलम रो थोरासिक वर्टिब्री अच्छी डर्साल सरफेस रे एंटीरियर अच्छे आमर क्लाविकल बोन और शोल्डर बोन पोस्टीरियर आमर अच्छी आमर डायफ्राग्राम एवं एभली गोटे रिब्स अच्छी 12 पेयर रिब जे कि स्टर्नम आउ वर्टिब्रल कलम को कनेक्ट करुच्ची एभली एक थोरासिक कैविटी अच्छी इनसाइड दैट थोरासिक कैविटी गोटे पेयर लंग्स ये एयर टाइट होकिना अच्छी सो इंस्पिरेशन बेले दुईटी सेट्र मसल पिला माने यूज हुए गोटे फ्रेनिक मसल गोटे होची एक्सटर्नल इंटरकोस्टल मसल एवं ये होची गोटे एक्टिव प्रोसेस मेकानिकल एनर्जी इज कंज्यूम्ड सो कौन हुए फ्रेनिक मसल क्या कहते फ्रेनिक मसल्स आर द मसल्स दैट कनेक्ट फ्रॉम डायफ्राग्राम टू रिब्स एंड वर्टिब्रल कॉलम एंड ड्यूरिंग दिस इंस्पिरेशन प्रोसेस as phrenic muscle contracts diaphragm becomes flattened and as the external intercostal muscle contract the sternum and the ribs become forward and upward so now the volume of dotted line is more than the volume of solid line that means the volume of thoracic cavity increases as sternum becomes forward as ribs become upward and forward as diaphragm becomes flattened so that the volume of dotted line the volume of thoracic cavity increases as volume of thoracic cavity increases due to the lungs remain airtight present the volume of lungs also increases and as volume increases pressure decreases and during that time partial pressure of oxygen at the lungs is 100 and during always in our atmosphere partial pressure of oxygen is 159 at the atmosphere so according to obeying the law of diffusion the atmospheric oxygen which is at higher partial pressure at the atmosphere that is 159 rushes into the lungs where it is at lower partial pressure that is 100 with a respiratory path that is pila mane hoche inspiration next then come to expiration it is just one passive process it is just one the passive process expiration or exhalation the expelling out of carbon dioxide carbon dioxide reach foul air from the lungs to the atmosphere and it is one passive process during normal involuntary process, just what muscle contracts, they relaxes, and no other mechanism is there. But in forceful expiration, one is your abdominal muscle, and another internal intercostal muscle. Abdominal muscle and internal intercostal muscle. The abdominal muscle attached to the abdomen, and as these two muscles, they works during forceful expiration, but in a normal expiration it is just the passive process of inspiration. जो मसल रो कंट्राक्शन रे थोरासिक कैविटी रो वॉल्यूम बढ़ी थिला, से मसल रो रिलैक्सेशन रे कौन हैला ना रिब्स, स्टर्नम एंड डायफ्राग्राम come to their original position, so that their volume decreases, pressure increases, and the carbon dioxide, which is at higher partial pressure at the lungs, then is expelled out from the lungs to the atmosphere. Okay, and but in forceful expiration, the abdominal muscle and intercostal muscle functions. Abdominal muscle contraction, intercostal muscle contraction रे आमे थरे पिला माने फोर्सफुली एंती करछे, सेई टाइम रे ए दीटा मसल रो काम होची, नचेत नॉर्मल एक्सपिरेशन रे जेते बेले हमर इनवॉल्यूंटरी प्रोसेस से तार चली आमे किछि करू नै, से नॉर्मल इंस्पिरेशन रे एक्सपिरेशन रे कोन होची पिला माने डायफ्राग्राम ता जगह को आसिला, डायफ्राग्राम जोटा फ्लैटेंड हेतिला दैट बिकम कन्वेक्स शेप हला, एवं स्टर्नम टी ता जगह को आसिला, रिब गुडी को ता जगह को आसिले वॉल्यूम ऑफ थोरासिक कैविटी कमी गला. आज वॉल्यूम ऑफ थोरासिक कैविटी डिक्रीजेस, सो लंग्स रो वॉल्यूम भी ता संगे संगे कमी गला. आज वॉल्यूम ऑफ लंग्स decreases, the pressure increases, and during that time the partial pressure of carbon dioxide at the lungs increases, and it is at the where 0.3 at atmosphere, it is at partial pressure of carbon dioxide at the lungs is 23, is 40, and partial pressure of at the 0.3. So lungs ro partial pressure lungs ro ये पिला माने आसिला. So this is the mechanism of breathing. Okay, so ये गला पिला माने हमरो respiratory system and mechanism of breathing. आमे नेक्स्ट क्लास रे पढ़िबा तारो कोन ना how gaseous respiratory gases exchange takes place, respiration exchange of gases and transport of gases. Thank you.